Hi, week 7 here. Can you believe it? That means next week is week 8, halfway through the class. Here we go. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit, as I have been for the last few weeks, about questions that are sort of extra bonus, above and beyond questions, not ones that you have to discuss, formally as literary analysis, but more questions that take the ideas, the characters, the events, the themes from the readings, and questions that sort of ask you to consider them in the context of the real world and your own life, in the hopes that you understand the ways, that you can see new ways that our actual existences do, in fact, tie to the fiction that we read. Okay, so if you are an on-the-spot student, and I'm sure you are, you will already have read the 3 stories for this week. The Creation by Maxime Clare, The Tenant by Bharati Mukherjee, The Bridegroom by Ha Jin. Okay, and so I'm going to ask you 3 questions here in this video, just something to consider for yourself with regards to each of the stories. There is a whole lot going on in the first story that you're asked to read for this week, The Creation. I feel like it's maybe one of the more complex stories in the book that I ask you to read, but one piece of the story has to do with, so this story is set a few decades in the past, but it is after the big Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which basically said no more separate but equal, because when things are separate, they are in reality never equal. Oh, by the way, some people think, speaking of law, some people think these earrings should be against the law, but I'm telling you, no, they're legal. Anyhow, even after the Supreme Court had this seminal decision made saying we're going to reform the way public education is done in this country so that all students, no matter their background, their race, their personal circumstances, will have equal opportunity to good education. Now, how's that worked out? It hasn't worked out at all. If you like to listen to podcasts, there are a couple really good podcasts that go over the continuing injustices between schools that are dominant in terms of white enrollment versus, say, black enrollment. There's one about public schools in Nashville that is called The Promise. Season 2 is very good in terms of examining kind of two schools that are 1 mile apart from each other in Nashville, and each are 90% or more either white enrolled or black enrolled. Fascinating. There's also one, am I going to get it right? Dear White Parents, that looks at a school in New York City. So if you're interested in this issue, and I got to say, you might think you're not, but if you click through those podcasts really, really quickly, I think you'd be like, oh, wow, this is engaging information. All right. So what I want to know here is Brown versus Board of Education supposedly changed things. It was a law that supposedly changed things in the United States. In actuality, in de facto practice, nah, the problem still exists. In a way, the law is an empty promise to the citizens of the United States, or at least to some of the citizens of the United States. And so I just would ask you to consider, in what ways are other laws also sort of empty promises? We get angry, we want to shout about things sometimes, and we say, but the law says, but do we all really stay under the speed limit all the time? Duluth has a city policy on the books that if your dog is within city limits in a public area, your dog has to be on a leash. I can go for a walk at Leicester, Hartley, Chester. I can go to almost any park in the city. And when I'm on a trail, when I am out for a walk or a run, I will, let's say I'm out for an hour or two, I will usually encounter 6 to 15 off-leash dogs who like to rush up, jump on me, etc., etc. Here's the thing. People always say, oh, you're not a dog lover. Oh, you got that wrong. I love dogs. You know what I don't like all the time? Dog owners. So for me, I get very frustrated by the fact that in the city of Duluth, leash laws, empty promises. They're not enforced. There's no consequences. But I think you could look at federal laws, you could look at state laws, you could look at city policies, and just try and consider for yourself, how much do you put trust in those laws to sort of protect the citizenry, and how much in actuality do those laws actually protect the citizenry. In the second story this week, The Tenant, we have a character named Maya, and she's on a personal journey that often involves sexual explorations with a variety of men. So she's figuring some stuff out. But one idea that does come up in the story that you can sort of pull out as a thread that you then consider in terms of your own life, decisions, existence. There's this idea in the story that dead space, so empty space, need not suffocate. So sometimes we feel like everything has to be filled up. I mean, that could be a physical thing. When I was growing up in my house, boy, did we have clutter. Like my mom wanted our house to feel like a museum. She wanted like antiques bought at auctions, but then every shelf space, every bookshelf, every coffee table, every open space in the house was full of knickknacks. She couldn't have any dead space. And I could go into a deep psychological analysis here about what that tells us about my mother as a whole, but we don't have 4 hours. So anyhow, sometimes we're sort of taught that dead space is not a good thing. Even in conversation, that awkwardness when there's a lapse in speech and it goes quiet and you sort of feel like, oh, I should say something. I should say something. And sometimes it's good to just, okay, let's just be quiet for a minute. If we don't have anything to say, we can just let there be dead space. So I like that the story brings up this idea of, when and how is dead space like a good thing? When does it not have to suffocate us? So I would ask you to consider for yourself how and where in your life has filling in dead space proved to be a boon? And how and where has it been a good thing to just leave it empty? So just considering, I think even just the analytical task of looking at your life and thinking, what is dead space in my life? What forms does dead space take? When is it a good thing? When is it something that I feel nervous about? And we could argue that the year 2020 with pandemic living, it was kind of a crash course in dead space where you don't go to school anymore. Maybe you don't go to work anymore because there were all these layoffs. And you have a lot of hours. Maybe you weren't supposed to see your friends, this kind of stuff. So a lot of people panicked in the face of all that dead space. They almost felt suffocated by like too much alone time, too much not going anywhere, too much every day. And then I feel like after a few months, a lot of folks kind of settled into it or rebounded. I mean, of course, there were the sort of jokes, like everyone made sourdough bread and, everyone took up new hobbies or whatever. To try and fill that dead space. But I think for some people, they realized that their lives were better with less hustle, bustle, fill. Don't let there be dead space. They realized like, oh, so I'm not setting an alarm in the morning, or I'm doing my work, but at the hours I want to do it throughout the day. And so I think there were I saw some really good Twitter threads, to be honest, from people where they made long lists of how their lives were better thanks to the shifts that the coronavirus brought about for us. So for yourself, consider, where do you have dead space, and could there be an upside to it? And the final story this week is The Bridegroom, the main topic of which is life in China, a very repressive culture in terms of what the government has done to citizens' rights and just social rights. So for us, I feel like the United States, as much as we are problematic, we have evolved in terms of our discussions about homosexuality and discussions of gender being something that happens on a continuum and so on. So for American readers, it can be a little shocking to read this depiction of how repressed homosexuality was and actually still is in China. And we should remember that what you read in that story is very much like what the United States was like in times before the 1990s or maybe the 2010s even, when I think about it. But, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even in the 80s when I was coming up, can you imagine? In the 80s, like, it was sort of not okay still. And there was, let's talk about hate crimes. There's all sorts of, in our recent history, there's a lot of there were laws, evidence, behaviors that were very much against homosexuality. So let's continue to grow, okay? But in China, as we see it in this story, it's not okay. And so that's the gist of the story, is examining that. But I do think that there's sort of also a subcurrent you can think about that's true for everyone, just to consider. And it is, to what extent is marriage actually about love? I mean, people love their Pinterest boards. Oh, don't some folks like to plan their weddings for years, and this dress and this dress and that fight about this, and then my bridesmaids won't, and this. But outside of the emphasis we put on the actual wedding, I think sometimes couples forget that wedding is the starting gun at the marathon, and everything that comes after is actually the true race. But anyhow, I just think historically, marriage was definitely not about love. It was about transfer of ownership and property through a human being. And often, I think then even later, let's say in the 1950s, the cultural pressure to get married. There's the joke that, in the 40s and 50s, young women went to college to get their MRS degree, because the whole thing was you go to college so you can find someone to marry. Now, is that really a love match? Not necessarily. We've also looked at arranged marriages around the world, and how sometimes families come together to decide my son should marry your daughter, or they use a matchmaker. And that's not necessarily about love. The assumption is love could grow after the fact. So we get very romantic about love. We get all woo, woo, woo. But is it really? And a lot of times people think they are a love match and they've met their person, and within a year, 2, 3, it's like, no, save me, help me, let me out. So I just think that that's a question, because it's something that we sort of blithely trip along and just, oh, tra-la-la, let's throw rose petals. And the reality of marriage is it's an institution, but I'm not sure it's always one that is as ethereal and lofty as we sometimes pretend it is. So that's your food for the thought for week 7. All right. Ta-da.